Today we're going to be beginning Chapter 10, where we're focusing on meiosis and sexual reproduction, and we're really going to be targeting the similarities and the differences between meiosis and mitosis. Now we need to review here a little bit just about reproduction as a whole before we discuss meiosis. And so just as a reminder, in asexual reproduction, the type of reproduction that we classify as being different than sexual reproduction, the parent is always making offspring that are getting a full set of all of its DNA. So the DNA is copied completely by mitosis, and then you end up with an offspring, or usually multiple offspring, that would all be genetically identical to that parent. Now, we're kind of being a little bit loose with terminology here. It may not technically be mitosis if it's something like a bacterial cell. It'd actually be binary fission, but the same idea. We're getting offspring that are genetically identical, and you can produce lots of offspring very, very quickly. Something like a fungus, if it's reproducing asexually, may produce millions of offspring in a very short period of time. Now, the good thing about this is if the parent is very well adapted to its environment, if it has good traits, all of the offspring will also have good traits, and you assume that most adults that are able to reproduce in the environment are probably fairly well adapted. So if you have good traits, you're going to pass those on. And the downside, of course, is if you have bad traits, you're going to pass those on as well. Now, on the flip side of this, with sexual reproduction, the key concept here is that every parent, each parent, is going to contribute only one gene per trait. Now, one of the fallacies some people have about sexual reproduction is they think it always requires two parents. You can have one parent playing both the role of both the mother and the father, although this is definitely not something that happens in humans. This is something that happens very frequently in plants. A tree may be both the mother and the father and producing seeds. But when we're talking about this sexual reproduction of passing on one gene per trait, what we start talking about is the fact that those genes may not be identical to each other. And each form of a trait we call an allele. And when we get to Chapter 10, we're going to be discussing more about alleles and things like dominant and recessive that I'm sure you remember. We'll get into Punnett squares and different ways of analyzing the inheritance at that point. However, the key concept for this chapter is what's going on with those alleles while the gametes are being formed. What happens is every time a gamete is formed by the same parent, there's an opportunity for lots of scrambling around of which alleles are going to get passed on. So every single gamete that's produced has the potential to be genetically unique, and realistically speaking, is going to be genetically unique. There may be some very slight differences between one and another, but once you have fertilization between two unique gametes, of course you're going to have offspring that are genetically unique. And what that gives you is much more variation than what we see in species that reproduce asexually. If they reproduce asexually, the only chance of variation would be through mutations. But here, every offspring produced by sexual reproduction is going to have variations in it. And variation is absolutely key to evolution. So when we finish up genetics and go into our evolution unit, one of the ideas we're going to start with is the fact that you have to have variation for species to evolve. Well, we're going to do a big picture today of what's going on in meiosis. No real details here, but a few terms you may remember or may not remember. In meiosis, you start out with cells that are what we refer to as diploid cells, and we're going to end up with, at the end, cells that are haploid. Now, if this is an animal cell, something like a human, those haploid cells are going to be gametes. It'd either be sperm or egg cells that are going to be produced at the end. But this idea of diploid and haploid is all about chromosomes. If you have a cell that is diploid, that means that there are two chromosomes of every type of chromosome possible in that cell. In other words, if you actually look at the chromosomes, you'll see two identical looking chromosomes of every type. And we usually call these pairs of chromosomes, or the proper term, they're called homologous chromosomes. The prefix homo means the same, so the homologous chromosomes are not identical chromosomes, but they're the same type of chromosome. And we use the symbol 2n for diploid cells, where n refers to the number of unique types of chromosomes in a cell. And in this particular cell, there are twice as many as the number of unique types of chromosomes. In meiosis, what happens is each chromosome finds its partner, its homologous pair, and they're going to temporarily pair up and make sure that the new cells that are formed at the end of meiosis no longer have those pairs. Only one member from each pair will go to each new cell. And we'll look at the details on that with how this takes place. Now, as we're talking about meiosis, I'm hoping you'll see some similarities here between mitosis and meiosis. Back in Chapter 9, when we looked at the specific stages of mitosis, the details of what happened in prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, hopefully you'll see some of those same things here. And some of the key ways they're the same is the fact that before you have the replication time period, or before you have the division of the nucleus, during that interphase time period, the chromosomes are going to replicate themselves. You have to make those copies. Another way they're the same is the mechanism for movement of the chromosomes. It's still spindles that are moving them around. We're not going to discuss that really in this chapter because it's exactly the same type of movement as what we saw back in Chapter 9. And another similarity is after the nucleus divides, in this case, in a meiotic division, you're going to have to follow that up by cytokinesis to split the cytoplasm also. And by the way, I'll just mention before we leave here, meiosis is the proper pronunciation of this word. A lot of people want to pronounce that E because they see it at the beginning of the word. They want to call it meiosis. The proper pronunciation is meiosis, which means, since we have two words that sound so similar, mitosis and meiosis, you need to really make sure you're clear about which one you're saying, and especially if you're spelling them on something like an AP essay. If you're going to talk about mitosis, you've got to make sure you have that T in there. If you're going to discuss meiosis, even though it's silent, you better put that E in there. If you just spell it M-I-O-S-I-S, the people who are grading it can't tell whether you left the T out or the E out. So be really careful in distinguishing between those two words. Like I say, especially because they sound so similar. Now, we're also going to see in this chapter, in Chapter 10, some ways that mitosis and meiosis are not alike. Some ways they're actually quite different from each other. And the key ways they're different is the fact that in meiosis, the nucleus actually divides 2 times. And so to distinguish the 2 divisions, we call the first division meiosis 1 and the second one meiosis 2. But in mitosis, there was only 1 division, and then we had cytokinesis, and it went back through interphase. Another difference here, at the end of mitosis, we went from 1 cell to 2 cells. When meiosis is finished, because of those 2 divisions, you divide 1 cell into 2, and each of those divide again, you end up with 4 new cells. But definitely the biggest difference, the most important difference between meiosis and mitosis is here we're producing haploid cells. In mitosis, the cells were genetically like the original cell, so if you were starting with a diploid cell, you end with a diploid cell. When we get to the second part of Chapter 10, we're going to look at those details of what happens during the stages of meiosis. If you have any questions, bring them to class, and have a good day.